War is fought with bullets, tanks, and bombs, but sometimes it's also fought with paint, sound, and imagination. In 1944, deep in the chaos of Europe, the U.S. Army created something that shouldn't have existed, a ghost division. An army that didn't fight, but deceived. Its mission, to trick Hitler's forces into believing in illusions so real, they could change the outcome of battles. This wasn't a squad of hardened soldiers or seasoned generals. It was made up of artists, sound engineers, theater set designers, and fashion illustrators. People who once painted canvases and built Broadway stages, now tasked with building an army that didn't exist. They called it the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but history would remember them by another name, the Ghost Army. Their weapons were rubber tanks, wooden planes, fake artillery, and giant loudspeakers that could broadcast the sound of entire divisions moving through the night. They carried no live ammunition, but their work could move thousands of enemy troops, redirect airstrikes, and shape the course of battles, all through deception. When the real soldiers were preparing to move, the Ghost Army moved in first. They would set up fake camps, complete with tents, vehicles, and even laundry hanging from lines, just to convince German scouts that a massive force had arrived. From the air it looked flawless. Inflatable Sherman tanks were rolled into fields. Wooden trucks lined the roads. Even fake tire tracks were carved into the mud to complete the illusion. And at night the air came alive with sound. Massive speakers hidden in jeeps would blast hours of recorded engine noise, convoys rumbling, tanks rolling, soldiers shouting. The Germans would listen, intercept, and believe. Their deception was so convincing that entire Panzer divisions were moved to counter threats that didn't exist. In one operation near the Rhine, a small team of ghost soldiers pretended to be an entire armored division. There were less than 1,000 of them. But through lights, sound, and radio trickery, they convinced the Germans that over 20,000 men were preparing for an assault. The result? German forces repositioned their defenses, leaving real Allied troops free to advance through weaker lines. Among the Ghost Army were men who would later become famous: fashion designer Bill Blass, photographer Art Kane, and painter Ellsworth Kelly. They sketched enemy positions, painted camouflage, and created stagecraft for the deadliest theater the world had ever known. Every mission came with danger. If they were caught, there was no protection. They had no heavy weapons, no reinforcements, nothing to defend themselves. If the Germans discovered the truth, the Ghost Army would have been annihilated instantly. But they never broke. They laughed, painted, and created art in the middle of a war. Their creativity became a weapon sharper than any sword. By the end of the war, their illusions had saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. They staged over 20 major deceptions, covering retreats, offensives, and supply movements, every time giving the Allies an invisible shield of confusion and fear for the enemy. Yet for decades their story remained hidden. It was classified, forgotten. The world celebrated generals and heroes, but not the artists who fought with light and sound. It wasn't until 1996 that the truth came to light. Documents were declassified, revealing the incredible details of the Ghost Army's operations, the sketches, photos, and inflatable tanks that had once fooled Hitler's intelligence network. And when the surviving members were finally recognized, they were no longer just artists or soldiers. They were something else entirely, creators of illusion who had turned art into a weapon of war. In a world consumed by destruction, they built something different. They built ghosts, and those ghosts helped win the war. The war was ending, but for the men of the Ghost Army, the illusions had to keep going until the very last day. As Allied forces closed in on Germany, chaos filled the front lines. The enemy was desperate, unpredictable, and still dangerous. The Ghost Army's final acts of deception would be their most daring yet. In March 1945, the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine River, one of the last major natural barriers standing between them and the heart of Germany. The Germans knew this crossing would be critical. They expected a massive assault, and they were ready to throw everything they had to stop it. But the Ghost Army was already there. Under the cover of darkness, they rolled their rubber tanks toward the riverbank, set up fake artillery, and blasted the sounds of trucks and soldiers arriving by the thousands. From the air, Allied reconnaissance planes filmed the scene. It looked indistinguishable from a real division preparing for war. German spotters fell for it completely. 4 days, enemy units poured artillery onto positions that didn't exist. Every shell they fired wasted their last reserves. Every troop they moved away from the true crossing weakened their final defense. When the real attack came, at a completely different location, the Germans were unprepared. The Allies stormed across the Rhine with minimal resistance. The Ghost Army had fooled them one last time. And then, just as quietly as they'd arrived, they vanished. No parades. No medals. No headlines. They packed up their inflatable tanks and left behind fields filled with the ghosts of war. For decades, their existence remained one of the U.S. Army's best-kept secrets. Even their families didn't know. Letters home talked about mapping units or engineering work, never revealing the truth. Only much later, when the operations were finally declassified, did the world begin to understand what they had done. Historians would later say that the Ghost Army shortened the war, not by killing enemies but by confusing them so deeply they couldn't act effectively. Their deception saved real soldiers' lives. Men who might have died in ambushes, artillery strikes, or head-on attacks that never happened. In total, the Ghost Army's fake operations diverted entire German corps. They made Hitler believe phantom divisions were advancing through France, Belgium, and Germany. They turned radio waves, sound, and shadow into their weapons. One soldier from the unit once said, "We were pretending to be something we weren't, but in doing that, we saved people who really were." Their legacy isn't just military. It's human. Because at its heart, the Ghost Army story is about imagination under fire, about creativity surviving in a world built to destroy it. Many of those men went back to their old lives after the war. They painted, designed, and created art once again, but they carried something no one else could ever understand. The memory of nights spent inflating rubber tanks while tracer rounds cut across the sky. The laughter in between missions, when they made the world's deadliest army chase shadows. The feeling of turning illusion into armor. In 2022, after nearly 80 years, the United States finally awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, recognizing their courage, innovation, and extraordinary contribution to the Allied victory. They had fought without weapons, deceived without cruelty, and defended without hate. In the greatest war humanity had ever known. The Ghost Army proved that sometimes, imagination wins wars. As the war faded into memory, Europe lay in ruins. Entire cities turned to rubble, millions displaced, and the world scarred in ways words could barely describe. Yet hidden among the wreckage was the legacy of those who had fought not with steel, but with illusion. The men of the Ghost Army returned home quietly. No one knew what they had done, not their families, not even their fellow soldiers. They carried their secret like an invisible medal, heavy with the knowledge that they had changed the course of history and could never speak about it. In dim studios and classrooms across America, some of them picked up brushes again. They painted landscapes, portraits, and abstract shapes. Yet somewhere in every piece there was always a hint of what they'd seen. The haze of smoke, the flicker of explosions, the illusion of depth and movement. Their art had once fooled an empire. Now it told stories no one else could see. Others became designers, photographers, engineers, creators who built the modern world while carrying memories of the war's strangest secret. But every so often, when they met another ghost, there was a look of understanding, a silent nod. They knew what they had done together. It wasn't until the 1990s that the world began to uncover the truth. Declassified reports showed how the Ghost Army's deception missions had saved thousands of lives. Military strategists studied their work and realized that these artists had, in their own way, pioneered psychological warfare. Their techniques, sound design, visual misdirection, radio mimicry, would go on to shape modern military strategy for decades. Even now, every major army on Earth studies the principles the Ghost Army invented on the fly, under fire, in fields of mud and fear. The ghosts had changed the way wars were fought forever. When interviews with the surviving members finally began, their words carried no bravado. They didn't see themselves as heroes, just a bunch of artists trying to help end a nightmare. They spoke of the nights when they painted fake tank shadows under moonlight, of moments when they heard German guns firing at their decoys and realized their illusion was working. One veteran recalled, "We didn't fight the enemy with guns, we fought their minds." There's something poetic in that in the darkest chapter of human history, creativity became a weapon of mercy. Decades later, when the U.S. Congress finally recognized them, only a few were still alive to receive the honor. The medals glimmered beneath the lights, reflecting faces aged by time, but still filled with that same spark, the one that had outwitted Hitler's war machine. Their story reminds us that victory isn't always won by strength alone. Sometimes it's won by imagination, courage, and the unyielding belief that even in war, creation can triumph over destruction. The Ghost Army left no graves, no monuments, no battlefields bearing their name. But their echoes remain, in every act of cleverness that saves a life, in every strategy that uses light instead of fire, illusion instead of blood. They were the artists of deception, the soldiers of shadows. And though their war ended long ago, their ghosts still march, across history, across memory. forever reminding us that even in hell, imagination is undefeated. Even as time moved on and the world turned its attention to new wars and new enemies, the story of the Ghost Army refused to fade completely. Whispers of their missions lingered in dusty archives and faded photographs. Rows of rubber tanks lying in meadows, wooden trucks painted with shadows to mimic steel, sound engineers splicing together fake battle noises from bits of magnetic tape. Somewhere in a museum basement, a few of those inflatable tanks still exist, silent, deflated reminders of how imagination once stood between life and death. The rubber has grown brittle with age, the paint peeling, but if you look close enough, you can still see the fingerprints of the men who carried them through mud and gunfire. When historians interview the last surviving members, there's always the same pause before they answer. A faint smile. A faraway look. And then they talk about the laughter, because even in war they found ways to laugh. They talk about the nights they painted fake division symbols on their trucks, about swapping patches to become a different unit overnight. The enemy thought there were 100 divisions where there were only a handful. There was one mission where they camped so close to German lines they could hear the enemy talking in the distance. If the Germans had discovered they were fakes, the illusion would have shattered instantly, and the Ghost Army would have been wiped out. But the Germans never found out. The ghosts slipped away before dawn, leaving behind their rubber tanks half deflated and a trail of false tire marks stretching into the mist. When you see the photos now, it almost looks surreal. Soldiers carrying a tank on their shoulders, laughing like stagehands in a strange theater. But that was the essence of it. They were performing for an audience that couldn't see them, acting out scenes of war to save those fighting the real one. In an era when the world seemed intent on tearing itself apart, the Ghost Army built illusions. Not to deceive for power but to protect, to preserve. They turned art into armor. Long after the war ended, some of their techniques found new life in the modern world. Not just in the military but in film, design and technology. Every projection, every camouflage pattern, every act of visual trickery owes something to the ghosts who first imagined the impossible. And maybe that's the quiet truth of their legacy. That even when nations forgot them, their influence never disappeared. It lingers in the way we see, in the way we think, in the belief that creativity has a power of its own. Today, when visitors walk through exhibitions about the Ghost Army, they stand before the same maps, radios, and sketches that once guided those illusions. They see the names of men who spent their youth pretending to be entire armies, not for fame or glory but because it might save someone else. And as they leave, one thing becomes clear. The Ghost Army was never just about deception. It was about imagination in defiance of fear, about using creation to stand against destruction. Their ghosts still whisper across the pages of history, not with the sound of gunfire, but with the quiet hum of creativity that refused to die, even in the darkest of times. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon in war isn't violence. It's the mind that dares to dream in the middle of it. The war had long ended, but the echoes of the Ghost Army never truly faded. Their names were lost in paperwork, their deeds buried under classified ink, but their spirit lived on. In every soldier who learned to think differently, to fight smarter, to survive. In quiet towns across America, those who had once built illusions returned to ordinary lives. Some became artists again, some taught, some built cities and homes. None of them boasted. They knew what they'd done. They'd already played their part on the world's greatest stage and that was enough. But sometimes, in the late hours of night, when memory drifted back to the fields of Europe, they could still hear the hum of the generators, the distant rumble of fake engines echoing through the dark. They could see the ghostly outlines of tanks shimmering in the fog, shadows moving across moonlit ground, illusions so perfect they felt alive. They would remember how, for a few fleeting hours, they had convinced the most powerful army in the world to chase ghosts. And in that deception, they had saved thousands who never even knew they existed. Decades later, when the truth was finally revealed, the world was stunned. An army of artists, actors, painters and dreamers had helped win the Second World War, not with blood but with brilliance. They had proved that creativity could be a shield, that art could save lives, that imagination could outweed hate. In 2022, when the last of the Ghost Army stood to receive the Congressional Gold Medal, the applause wasn't just for the men in the room, it was for the invisible ones who had vanished into history. For those who had marched under no flag, fired no shots, but whose illusions helped end a nightmare. They had turned deception into salvation. They had painted victory out of thin air. They were soldiers who carried no weapons, and yet they were among the most powerful of them all. Because when the world was drowning in chaos, they dared to create. And in that act of creation, they found a way to make the impossible real. The Ghost Army may have disappeared long ago, but their story remains. A reminder that sometimes the sharpest weapon isn't forged from steel or fire. It's born from the human imagination. And even now, long after their rubber tanks have deflated and their radios have gone silent, their legacy endures. A whisper through time. A testament to the idea that even in war, art can save the world.